All right, it is 10:30 on the dot, and it looks like we have people joining from all over. We have a couple here local to us in Red Bluff. We have some down in just over nearby in Orland, and we have others joining in from as far as Los Angeles and San Francisco. Another one from Northridge as well. Welcome out, everyone. I'm very glad to see you all here. Now let's get on with it officially. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here today. My name is Mr. Hine, and I'm here at the William B. Adobe State Historic Park on the ancestral land of the river Nomlaki people. So using the reactions button on the bottom toolbar of your Zoom window, once again, would you send in a reaction if you have ever been to a state park before? Oh, getting a couple thumbs up here. Got a hand raised. Awesome. Now let's make this a little bit more specific. Have any of you ever been to this state park, William B. Adobe? Oh, seeing a couple thumbs up. Awesome. Well, where is William B. Adobe State Historic Park? I'm going to share my screen for you here. Oh boy, I got too many windows. All right. I apologize for that taking a little bit of time there. So this is just a nice big overview of North America, and we'll start zooming in here. As we're coming down, naturally it is going to focus on California. We are in the upper section here, right on that pin. There we are, just outside Red Bluff, right along the Sacramento River. You can see on the right-hand side of the screen. Adobe is one of 280 state parks in California. State parks preserve both our history and our natural areas. Today we're at a historic site and we have a great field trip planned for you. And now I'll be passing it across to Miss Lamoureux.
Hi, I'm Miss Lamoureux, as he said, at William B. Adobe State Historic Park. And I have a friend that's going to be coming along on our field trip with us today. You might know who he is as well. I want you to go ahead and send that reaction button. Raise your hand if you know my friend Flat Stanley. Well, I see a couple of you might. Well, Flat Stanley mailed himself to the park this last summer, and we took some video of what he got up to while he was here. Now, you're going to go over the Bridge of Time with Flat Stanley and my friend, Mrs. Pooley. I'll check in on you a few times along the way, but let's get going, back to 1852.
Do want to jump in. I apologize for the interruption, Miss Lamoureux. Before we join Mrs. Pooley, if any of you have any questions, feel free to use the question and answer function. We will answer them when we have an open spot available for you.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to William B. Adobe State Historic Park. My name is Mrs. Pooley, and today, when we go across the Bridge of Time, we're going to be stepping back into the 1850s and exploring what it was like to live in early pioneer California. Now, I understand that some of you have been reading Flat Stanley's Escape to California by Jeff Brown. Well, it just so happens that Flat Stanley mailed himself to the park, and he's going to be joining us on the tour. You're going to see him along the tour, and he's going to be in some funny places. Now, in the 1850s, there were three big things that they did not have that we have today. Can you guess any of the three? Right, electricity was one, and another one was modern transportation or cars, and the third one was something that we use in our homes every day, and that was indoor plumbing. Now, when we cross over the Bridge of Time, we're going to be looking for clues to see how the pioneers lived without these big three things. And I want you to look for Stanley, too. Well, dog my cat, there's Flat Stanley across the Bridge of Time right now. He's waiting for us. Let's go over to 1852. Pioneer times, this was wild country, and you couldn't just go to the supermarket to buy your food. So many of the pioneers brought seeds across the prairie with them to start their gardens. Other pioneers wrote home to their friends and family to please send seeds to start their plants. Now, without refrigeration, the plants had to be able to be dried, or they had to be able to be stored for some time. So we have a garden right here. Let's go inside and see what's growing. Come on. Mrs. Lombardo.
Good morning.
Good morning. And Mrs. Hardwick.
Good morning, Mrs. Pooley.
I see that you are hard at work here, but do you mind taking a moment to show us what's growing in your garden?
Absolutely. So we have bullnose peppers, yellow tomatoes, cayenne peppers, and the Three Sisters growing.
The Three Sisters?
Yes, Mrs. Pooley. Corn is the first of the Three Sisters.
The corn grows tall so the beans have something to climb.
And then here are the beans right here going up the corn.
Oh, I see them going right up.
Mm-hmm.
For its part, the beans pull nitrogen from the air and put it in the soil for all three plants to use. This is called nitrogen fixing. Nitrogen is a really important nutrient for all healthy plants.
Sorry, Mrs. Lovato. I was so excited about the squash, and here's our third sister.
So the squash has two jobs: to keep the ground damp with its big leaves, and because the stems are prickly, it helps keep animals away like raccoons.
I see. They all grow so well together. It seems like a real benefit to us.
It is, and served together, they make a complete meal. And we have the corn,
Oh.
which then can be dried for later use, or you could eat it fresh. We have beans, and I don't have any beans to harvest this morning, but I have some dried ones to show you. So you can eat the beans fresh, or you can dry them for the winter.
For cooking for later.
Absolutely. And then that third sister is squash.
Oh, that looks like picnic squash.
It is. It's delicious. And that keeps pretty well without refrigeration.
That is wonderful.
Mm-hmm. All these together, when you serve them together in a meal, gives you the complex carbohydrates, it gives you fats, and it gives you protein.
A complete meal.
Complete. Now the only thing is, it gets a little tough being able to eat this every single night, day in and day out for supper. So Mrs. Lovano solved that for us. She planted marjoram, rosemary, and mint so we can flavor our meals and make them more interesting.
Oh, yeah, Mrs. Lovano.
I know.
Is that Mr. Stanley I see climbing the corn like a bean?
Oh,
It is.
Maybe he's trying to help with the harvest.
Maybe.
Stanley is always trying to help in his own way.
Well, let me tell you, Mrs. Lovano is a real clinker when it comes to harvesting and putting things up for the winter.
I can see that. She is a great. Well, it looks like you two are going to survive out here on the frontier.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for sharing your garden with us this morning. I must be going, but it was wonderful to see you, Mrs. Lovano. And thank you, Mrs. Hardwood.
Thank you, Mrs. Pooley, for visiting.
Goodbye.
Mrs. Pooley.
Bye-bye.
Just the way they grew their food and what they grew was a big clue to us about no electricity and so no refrigeration. Let's see what other clues we can find. Aha! What do we have here? Well, in the 1850s, indoor plumbing was not common, and so pioneers had to find other ways to go to the bathroom. So what they did is they would dig a big hole and they would build a small little house like this over it, far and out and away from their house, so as to distance themselves from unpleasant odors. Looks like Stanley might need a little private time. Let's see what else we can find. What do you suppose this big Adobe, or actually little Adobe, is for? Any guesses? Well, the pioneers used to hunt and raise animals for meat, but without refrigeration, they had to preserve it. So sometimes they would use salt and they would draw water out of the meat, Or sometimes they would build a smokehouse, and they would hang strips of the meat inside of the smokehouse from hooks or on a rack, and they would light a fire and they would make it really smoky, and they would smoke the meat over a period of a few days to really draw out all the moisture and preserve it. What they finally ended up with was something like beef jerky. Come on. Look at this big cauldron. This is a big clue. In the pioneer times, with no electricity, they had to find other ways to make light within their homes. And so they made candles, and they would use a big cauldron like this. They would fill it with tallow, which was animal fat. And they would heat up that tallow and make it really melted. And then they would take a willow stick or some sturdy stick with twine on it, and they would repeatedly dip it into the melted tallow, adding layer upon layer to their candle. Now, it looks like Mr. Stanley is ready to make his own candle. Let's go inside the Adobe. Come with me.
So before we go into the Adobe, I want to talk about what it might be like inside. It'd be hard to imagine a house without electricity. What are some of the things that you use electricity for in your home? It's used for so many things in our houses today. Go ahead and type in the Q&A something that you use electricity for in your house. Cooking dinner, that's a really good answer. We use it for our stoves and for our fridge and oven, exactly. How about to see? We were just talking about making candles. So lights, yes. Video games, yep. Without electricity, there are no video games or TV. I think a lot of us would be pretty disappointed about that nowadays. So without all of those things that we use electricity for, what do you think it would be like inside the Adobe? The Adobe has no electricity, so what might it be like inside? Are there any guesses? What do you think it might be like inside the Adobe with no electricity? Dark. It might be dark. You're very right. Dusty. It could be dusty. There might be candles. Exactly. That's how you keep it from being so dark. All of these are great answers. Well, now that we've guessed what it might be like inside the Adobe, let's go take a look for ourselves.
Here we are at the Adobe home. Come inside. This Adobe was built in 1852, and the pioneers used materials that they found right here to build the Adobe bricks. They used sand, clay, and hay to construct the bricks and build the home. Now, many pioneers lived in this home. The children would sleep upstairs in the loft. There's Flat Stanley up there already. And the parents would sleep down here with the babies. This is a rope bed. So it has a wood frame and then ropes that the pioneers made themselves that are suspending the mattress of the bed. Now, as you already know, we don't have indoor plumbing. So they had to haul water to the house every day. And this was a common chore for children. If they were lucky, they had a yoke like this one, and they could haul 2 buckets at a time, carrying it on their shoulders. Now they used water just like we do for washing and bathing. So if you wanted to wash your hands, you would have a bucket full of water and a ladle for getting your hands wet. And then you would have some soap made from tallow, just like your candles, for lathering up. You might also have a pitcher instead of a ladle and a bucket. We would also have a wash tub for our weekly bath. We would use this wash tub for also our wash day for washing our clothes. We would use the scrub board and a brush, and look at that, Stanley in there. He's always willing to give a helping hand. And then another thing you would notice is that we know there's no electricity in this house, so they would use the hearth here for cooking their food. The pioneers used Dutch ovens for cooking their food and cast iron pots. Now, they made a lot of things themselves, but they also had to bring some things in from other places. And you might be asking yourself, how did they get it here? How did the pioneers get here? Well, let's go outside and we're going to look at a highway that the pioneers used at that time for helping them bring people and things to the homestead. Come outside. During the gold rush, you might have headed to the northern mines by traveling on the Sacramento River. This natural water highway was used by pioneers who would hop on a ferry boat in San Francisco and then travel up to Red Bluff. They would use that to get people and supplies up here. But as you know, many of the pioneers came here by covered wagon. Now imagine you're on the last leg of your journey and you get here with your wagon and there's this big river. How are you going to get across? Well, some of the pioneers built platform ferries. And what they did is they would make a wooden platform and they would have ropes attached to it. And then they would be able to pull animals, carriages, and people across the river and ferry them from one bank to the other. There used to be a ferry right here called the Adobe ferry. Look at that Flat Stanley over there. He looks like he's headed to the ferry boat landing. But I suppose he could just turn himself into a kite and fly across the river. So people got supplies here on this natural water highway, but sometimes, like we talked about before, they made things themselves. And I wonder, how did they make things themselves without electricity? I think I hear somebody in the blacksmith shop. Let's go see what's happening in there. Now the black
Before we go into the blacksmith shop, I want to talk about the work and the chores that the kids did in the 1850s. If you lived in the 1850s, you wouldn't be lucky enough to be sitting in school all day. You would have been working. What's some of the work or chores that you do at home now? How are some of the ways you help around your homestead? Go ahead and type into the chat dishes. That is a helpful way to around the house. Cleaning your room. Feeding the animals. That's important on our modern homesteads and would have been important back in the 1850s also. Some more about feeding the animals, cleaning, doing laundry. Oh, wow, you are some hard workers. You sound like you're so helpful around your homesteads. Well, it sounds like you would have done as much work as the children in the 1850s did anyway. So let's just go see what kind of work they're up to in the blacksmith shop. Come on.
Blacksmiths was another important profession back in the gold rush days. The blacksmiths would heat up the forge using coal and then use the giant bellows to help fan the flames and keep it super heated. The hot metal would then become soft and could be hammered to make different tools such as fire pokers, hooks, horseshoes, and later railroad spikes. But another important thing of the day was making rope, and look who's here. We have Mr. McLaren, Hostler Nick, and Bear Gulch Josiah.
Howdy. Howdy, Miss Bully.
What, that is quite a contraption you have there. Is that a rope making machine?
Yes, sir.
Why, yes, Mrs. Pooley, we need 5 things to make rope. We need the rope making machine. We need sisal twine.
Oh, sisal twine.
We need the needle. We need the scissors. And we need some help.
I see.
Now, as you see us set up today, Mr. McLaren has already towed the mark to make a nice long piece of rope, and we'll be holding the needle, holding it straight up to make a straight piece of rope and very taut. And Josiah here, he's manning the crank, which is the most essential part in making a fine twisted rope. Now, with this sisal twine, I'll give one end for Mr. McLaren to hold. This is just my starter, as I begin to thread it through the crank hooks. Golly gee, there's so many uses for rope that I can hardly name them. Know of any, fellas?
I use my rope for tying my bedroll, and you can also use it to hang up your lanterns and tools.
Well, I use rope to mind my animals. My horses wander up to Shasta without it.
I also use rope for going fishing, make it into a nice fishing net.
Well, I use rope when I'm building a fence to lash the pieces of wood together.
Shoe dang.
Fellas, I told you to talk about it, not spit at each other about it. But we're still working here, so now that we're at the end of our sisal twine, I'll cut a nice piece for Mr. McLaren to also hold on to. And this is where the real work begins. Josiah, start cranking. And while he is cranking and Mr. McLaren is holding on to the needle, I will be preventing this. Ooh. See how nice it can get?
Ooh.
And sometimes we'll even have to uncrank it at times. But don't worry, all this effort is to make the perfect rope. Continue now with my hands back and forth to prevent that mess. You'll see it starts to twist with its partner. If it tried to twist with all of itself already, oh boy, it'd be a mess. Not straight in all places. It's almost like we're making 3 ropes into one super rope. You do want to give it time and patience, though. The longer you crank, the stronger it'll get. All right, stop. I'd say once it starts to bundle up like this in little bunches, that's when it's very strong. Now, I will take the needle from Mr. McLaren and he will hold the end. If you notice, as I move the needle, it turns on its own, but it's not a bad idea to also help turn it, as I and Mr. McLaren will do. Moving the needle prevents these parts from sticking together too early as we twist. And Josiah here is holding the crank steady so it doesn't unwound. A lot of effort goes into making ropes, because if you have a weak rope, by golly, you're gonna have a broken bed. Your mattress is gonna be on the floor, your fish can't be held up. By golly, your roof could collapse. Just a few more twists, and by now, you're fine to take out the needle. Because gee, gears and hooks, you wouldn't have nice rope without them.
My, that is a wondrous machine.
And out. Now with our ends here, we tie just a simple overhand knot. Simple, but gets the job done. On this end here, and this end here. And after all that effort, we have ourselves a right smart piece of rope.
My, that is a right smart piece of rope, and that is some type of technology. I don't think I've ever seen anything like that before.
By thunder, that Stanley has his own notion about how to use a rope.
Horn spoon!
Oh, that Stanley. My goodness, he's always trying to help in his own special way.
Showing one of many uses he sure did.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for showing us how this contraption works. It is certainly an important thing, rope making, and a wondrous machine. But I best be on my way. I think I hear somebody working in the wood shop. Goodbye, Mr. McLaren,
Goodbye, Mrs.
Bye,
Pooley.
Mrs.
Hostler Nick, and Bear Gulch Josiah.
Remember how I said children in the 1850s would be busy working and not sitting down all day? Well, I think we've been sitting for a little too long. So everybody go ahead and stand up. And we're just going to do a little bit of a stretch. So go ahead and lean over. And we're going to lean the other way, really lean and stretch. And we're going to come back to the middle and just give a little shake. All right. Go ahead and sit back down. And now that we're nice and refreshed, I'm curious as to what's going on in that wood shop. Let's go see.
Mr. Hughes, large of life and twice as natural.
Well, good morning, Miss Pooley. How are you today?
Very well, thank you. We came to your wood shop this morning, and it's beautiful in here. We were hoping that you had time to show us around a little bit and tell us a little bit about all of these tools that you use for making things.
Well, Miss Pooley, I always have time. I see you have some young folks with you,
I do.
and they need to know that some things about setting up a homestead. So, what can I tell you?
What are you making here?
Well, I'm roughing out the parts for a two-sided carrier. This is a two-sided carrier. Notice it's got two sides and a handle. That's why we call it a two-sided carrier. This is a fairly common but extremely useful piece to have around the house, around the farm, the homestead. It can be used by anybody who has something to tote around. A carpenter, a blacksmith, a mechanic, ladies in the house with their knitting, with their tatting, or even taking flatware to the table. I get so many requests for these, I could spend all my time just building these two-sided carriers.
Sounds like you could use some extra hands.
I could certainly use a couple of apprentices so that I could have them doing this while I'm off to doing the other stuff that's important around the homestead.
Well, we may have some here that would like to work with you. Now, this looks like a most useful thing, but what other things do you make here in the wood shop?
Virtually anything you use around the homestead. Chairs that you sit upon, benches, tables, beds. This building we had to put together when we got here. So the woodworker is extremely important, and all these young people need to understand and know the basics of doing woodworking, so when they set up their own homesteads, they know how to do it.
I'll tell you, I don't think we would have made it across the plains without a woodworker in our wagon train party. Why, he was fixing things all the time. The wagon wheels, the tongues on the wagons. We wouldn't have made it here without it.
Well, I had to replace 3 tongues on my wagon when we came across because the oxen kept jerking and breaking it.
My goodness. And what are these over here?
These are the tools that we use, and let me kind of run through what a woodworker might need to know and have around their shop. A tool for measuring. This is the yardstick. And
Now, what is that they say? Measure once or what is that, Mr.
measure once and cut, or measure twice and cut once. Otherwise, I've heard somebody say it's cut once and cuts twice.
Oh,
Ooh,
my.
my. Sorry about that, man. This is a square. This is for putting straight lines across your board, so you can cut a nice straight line for putting things together. You're going to want, you might have noticed when you came in, I was using a little mallet to work with a chisel, and you're going to want to have a good set of chisels, so get those.
Now, are those chisels up there in the cabinet too?
Yes, those are chisels up there in the cabinet.
My, so many.
Yeah, a good woodworker needs a good set of chisels. There's no way around it. You also need a good hammer. And when you get down to the mercantile and you buy a hammer, buy a good one. Don't buy cheap. So get good tools. buy good once and you won't have to worry about it. You're going to need some saws. Here's a back saw. We call it a back saw because there's heavy metal backing which keeps the blade nice and rigid so it doesn't wobble on you. And if you'd come in a little bit earlier, you would have seen me working with a back saw on a two-sided carrier because I'm using that to cut the preliminary lines for mortises and dados and rabbets. You're going to need some saws, and again, get good quality. That little back saw is not going to cut planks out for a table or chairs or a bed. You're going to need saws for that. And once you've got the saws, you're going to need some planes to smooth things out.
Now, did you carry those across the plains with you?
Well, no. When we got into the 40-mile desert and our animals started getting sick and dying, we started throwing out all sorts of stuff. My wife threw out her dresser, and she's lamented that ever since we got here. I'm going to have to build her a new one. But I threw out the wood parts and just kept the irons, because any place I get where I've got a tree or wood, I can make a block of wood, and if I've got the iron, I can make a plane. I made this one just the other day. Now, planes, again, come in various sizes. This is a block plane. It's small, doing light, small work. And I talked about sawing out that board or plank, because remember, the lumber we have here is pretty rough, and it doesn't come in the sizes you're going to need, so you've got to cut it down. And once you've ripped that board down, that edge isn't smooth. So this plane is big and long, and we call it a joiner, because that wobbly edge that you sawed needs to be straight so you can put it together with another board. This plane is so long because it will, as you slide it along the edge of the board, it will knock off the high points until it gets down to a nice, straight, smooth edge. So this is a joiner. Here's one other set of tools that you probably are going to need to put things together, is a brace and bit. Here's your brace and bit, and the bits come in sizes from very small to fairly large, and you want to get a complete set because you're going to need to bore various sizes of holes. So there's kind of a rough idea of a set of tools that when you set up your homestead, you're going to need.
Oh, and many tools of the trade. Thank you for showing us, Mr. Hughes.
Well, you're most welcome. I'm glad you stopped by.
Is that?
Oh, there's Flat Stanley.
That little sea squirt.
Well, I think I'm going to make him into an apprentice and at least get some work out of him. He just seems to be flitting around all over the place.
He does seem to have some interest. Well, I've heard they say many hands makes easy work.
Well, indeed they do, ma'am. And I'll tell you what, you bring those young folks back here at another time and we'll get into the details of how to put that two-sided carrier together.
Thank you. And well, we must press on. But thank you for your time, Mr.
You
Hughes.
have a nice day now.
Thank you. Well, youngins, it's been some pumpkins having you here with me at the homestead today. Thank you for coming with me, and that Flat Stanley, he cut a dash too. It was interesting finding clues about how the pioneers lived without the three big things: electricity, modern transportation, and indoor plumbing. Now, it's been a fine time here at Adobe, and I wish you all strength and fortitude out on the frontier. Now, it's time to return to the present, but please come back and see me again and look for more clues into how early California pioneers lived. Goodbye.
Now that you're back from your fun in the 1850s, I want to see how much you learned. Can anybody tell me what one of the three big things that they did not have back in the 1850s is? One of the three big things that they lived without. Go ahead and type your answers into the Q&A. Those three big things. I see electricity. Yes, that was one of them. Two more. A bathtub. That's getting on the right track there. And a washing machine. Those are both right. But what was the big thing that made them not have those? I see water, piping, indoor plumbing. There we go. That is what they didn't have. So no electricity, no indoor plumbing, and no modern transportation. There's that third answer in the chat. Well, it seems like you did learn something today. So we got to see a lot of the jobs that they were doing around the homestead. Now, I want to know, if you lived back in the 1850s on the homestead, what would you have wanted your job to be? Go ahead and type into the chat and let us know what you would have wanted to do if you lived on the homestead in the 1850s. Washing. Well, washing was certainly important. Gardener. Everybody needed to eat, so the gardener was one of everybody's favorite person on the homestead. They grew the food. Feeding the animals. Like I said, everybody needed to be fed, animals included. Be the blacksmith. Yes, all of our metal things need to be made, so that would be very helpful. Be a wood chopper. Yes, that would be important. We would need wood chopped for our fireplace, but we would also need woodworkers. Getting the water and being the gardener. Yes, they would have to go all the way down to the river to get their water. So it would be a big job to carry those buckets of water back and forth. Well, those are all great answers about what jobs you would have wanted to do on the homestead. Now, does anybody have any questions for me about life in the 1850s? Go ahead and type those questions into the chat. Any questions about what life was like back in the 1850s? What kind of animals did they raise? Well, they probably would have had chickens, because not only could they eat the meat of chickens, but they would lay eggs. So chickens would have been a very helpful animal. So would sheep, because again, sheep could provide meat, but more importantly, they provide wool, which could be spun into yarn. How long would it take? They would probably raise other animals as well and have a horse to help work the property. How long would it take to grow the food? That is a good question. Well, it depends on what they were growing. Some vegetables take longer to grow than others, and something like a fruit tree would take years to start producing fruit. So it really all depended on what they were growing. But a standard vegetable could grow in a season of a few months. And how would they get that food to eat? Again, they would grow it. So that, and possibly some trading with people nearby, but there really wasn't, on their homestead, they were pretty self-sufficient and would have to grow all their own food. Was life difficult in the 1850s? It certainly was. You had to live with what you do. And what that essentially means is your quality of life depended on how hard you worked. So if you planned right and you planted yourself a great garden and made sure that you dried out enough meat in your smokehouse, then you would live good through the winter, and it would be nice. But if you weren't planning, those winters were going to be really hard. And so, and everything about life in the 1850s was manual labor and doing what you had to do to survive. So it was difficult. What would my job be? Well, I think I would enjoy working in the garden if I lived on an 1850s homestead. How did they get to school? Well, schooling would not have been the same as we think about it nowadays. They wouldn't have traveled to go to school, and they wouldn't have even necessarily went to school. They would have been busy working around the homestead, and their parents would have taught them things. If there was enough kids in an area or children in an area, they may have a small schoolhouse where one of the moms or women of the homestead would have taught them things like reading or writing, but for the most part, it was not school the way we think of it today. Did they raise bunnies? That's a good question. They probably would have hunted rabbits, in all honesty. I'm not sure that they would have raised bunnies, though. How did the smokehouse work? Well, as it was very briefly explained in the video, the smokehouse was another Adobe structure, so it was well insulated. And they would light a fire inside, a low fire, and hang the meat over the fire. So it would stay at a really warm but low temperature in there, and the fat would slowly melt off the meat, leaving it dried out, kind of like jerky. And that jerky like meat would be able to be preserved and it wouldn't go bad. What kinds of things did they eat? Well, like I just mentioned, that they would preserve meat and it would be a jerky type substance. They would also eat meat fresh, though. They would eat what they grew in their garden. And a lot of that, like we saw in the video, were things that could be preserved. So they would grow corn and beans and squash, as well as things that they could pickle, like cucumbers or tomatoes. So they had a pretty large variety in their diet. How did they make houses? Well, that's a really good question. These houses are Adobe houses. So they were made out of Adobe bricks, which is a combination of mud and straw. The bricks are then laid out in the sun to dry, and then they're built up on each other to form the house. Of course, one of the buildings you saw in the video was made out of wood as well. And that would have been made by the woodworker. And he explained a little bit how he would take large boards from trees and make them into workable boards. So it just depended on what the house was made out of, on how they would build it. How did they go to the top floor of the house? Yes, we showed a loft in the video. They would have went up there with a ladder, a wooden ladder that they would have built. And how did they hunt animals? They did have early guns back then. They also could have used bow and arrow, and they would have had hunting knives as well. Was it hard to hunt for food? Just like it is today, I'm sure that it takes a certain amount of skill and stealth. But also, I'm guessing there was a little bit more animals present because there was more wilderness. Things were less developed. So it did take a certain amount of skill. These are all great questions, by the way. How did they get the metal for the blacksmiths? Well, they would have had, like the woodworker explained, he would save the metal parts of his tools. And after they were here, things could get shipped up on steamboat from more populated areas and then dispersed overland after that point. Do we have any more questions? Did they do math? They did. If they were fortunate enough to have some schooling, they would have done some arithmetic. They practiced the 3 R's is what they called it, and it was reading, writing, and arithmetic. Are there other jobs? Well, since we saw that there was a platform ferry here, there would have been people operating that. That would have been another job. The people who were operating the steamboats, bringing them up from the Delta. Definitely more work around the homestead. There would have been general land working. New things were probably being built constantly. People would be in charge of not only raising the animals, but hunting, fishing. You had to do the daily wash, to do the daily, just everything. Making meals in itself was a large chore. So there was just anything you can imagine now that we might do easily was kind of a job back in the 1850s. Did they use their own food to feed their animals? That's a great question. It has to do with some of the things they would grow in their garden. They had to grow things that they could feed their animals as well as things that they could feed themselves. So the varieties of corn that they would grow were often varieties that we wouldn't eat, but that animals loved. Did they have cows back then? Yes, cows were around, and some people in the area were cattle farmers. They definitely did have cows, and milking cows and turning that milk into butter was something that was a skill that many women did on the homestead. Were there any bathrooms near the schoolhouse? Well, as we saw, bathrooms weren't necessarily what we think of bathrooms today. They were an outhouse, which is a small shack built over a hole in the ground. So if there was a schoolhouse on a homestead, then there would also be an outhouse on that homestead. But really, you'd want it kind of far away from any other buildings, because the smell was unpleasant and it was unsanitary. What did kids play? Children did not have a lot of extra time for playing, but they did play. They would play jump rope. There's a game that's similar to what we think of as tug of war, although they called it hunker down and hassle the hostler. They would play a game called Graces that involves hoops and sticks. Hoop and stick is another game they would play. They would sing songs, but like I said, they were busy for a lot of their day doing chores and doing work around the homestead. How did they learn to read? If they were taught to read, it would normally be by their parents. They would pass down skills to their children. Were there any veterinarians? I don't think it would have been such an official title, but people that raised animals would have some knowledge about their health care, and maybe they would contact the local cattle farmer who knew more than they did if they just owned 1 or 2 cows. So there were people that had that skill, but there weren't even necessarily appointed doctors in the 1850s. So veterinarian wasn't quite a title. How did they take showers? Well, it wasn't a luxurious shower like we would take today. Showers were more of a bath, and they were taken in that lovely wash tub we got shown in the video, the same tub that you would wash your clothes or your dishes in. I know, it's not very cleanly. How did they get seeds for plants? Well, they would have saved seeds and brought them over with them on the covered wagon. They could have wrote home and had people send them seeds. Or once they got their garden established, they would be saving seeds from one year to the next so that they could replant the same crops. Where did they keep their cattle? Well, a lot of cattle at the time would be free roaming, and people would use brands so that they would keep track of where their cows were and who owned which cows. They wouldn't have large fenced-in areas like we think of today. Did they raise goats? Like sheep, goats could have been an animal that they raised as well. Goats are a good animal to raise because you can get milk from them as well. They wouldn't have been quite as beneficial as sheep, in my opinion, just because you can't get the wool from them. But were there wild pigs? That's a good question. We do have hogs in the air in Northern California today, so I would assume that they were also present back in the 1850s. Were there cities at that time? There weren't many around us. Old Shasta, which is north of here, was the queen city of the northern mines, and that would have probably been the closest city to this area. How did they make clothes? They would have brought some fabric with them if they were lucky, but really you'd only have 1 to 2 outfits. So if you were lucky enough to have sheep, you could spin that wool into yarn and you'd be able to mend your clothes, make new clothes, make collars and accessories for your dresses. Eventually they could get more fabric from other people, but they wore their clothes until they were worn out. It wasn't a closet full of clothes like we think of today. How many people usually lived on a homestead? Well, that one room adobe that you saw in our video, we do know of a family that lived there that had 10 kids. So you think that could have been 12 people in that one room adobe. So that families were large. With all that work to do around the homestead, it would be helpful to have a large family. How did they tell time? Well, an hourly time wasn't quite as important. They would have told time with the sun, rise with it and go to sleep with it with no indoor lighting. That's how a lot of people lived for many years. Did they play any instruments? Yes, there were instruments at the time, and somebody very likely could have brought a harmonica with them over on the trail and enjoyed that at night, as well as guitars. People would sing quite often. That was a common way to entertain yourself. Where would they find animals? If you're meaning animals to raise, they could buy them from other people who lived in the area who were already raising animals. They would have brought some animals with them while coming over. And then, of course, those animals would hopefully breed and you would have more animals. Were there wild horses? I would say not necessarily. What we think of as wild horses aren't really wild horses, and they weren't present in the time. People would own horses though, and I'm sure sometimes horses got loose and would live on their own, making them essentially wild. They would make the adobe bricks. So that was a question, where did they get the adobe bricks from? Well, since adobe is only made out of mud and straw, they had all the materials right there. So they could make the bricks themselves, and then they would put them in wooden forms and then dry them out in the sun. These are all great questions. Were there bison? Bison weren't necessarily in this area. They're more of a Midwest plains animal. Did they hunt bear? I'm sure that if they ran into a bear, they would be hunting them. How did they entertain themselves? Like I said, they would sing songs, play instruments, they would tell stories. Some of the children would play games. If they were lucky, they might even have a doll or a singular toy that they would play with. So they would find ways to entertain themselves. But again, you were busy working most of your day, so entertainment time was minimal. Another question about if they hunted, and if so, what did they hunt? We have deer population around here. We're right next to the Sacramento River, so they would have fished for salmon as well. And we have wild turkey in the area, all things that they would have had back in the 1850s. So those are what they would have hunted. Did they have dogs as pets? Great question. One of the issues we have all the time right now with our garden is deer. And we think that they wouldn't have had that issue because they would have probably had dogs. So yes, they would have had dogs as pets because those dogs would have helped them in their hunting and in the protection of their homestead from other animals. Did they have money? Not like we think of money today. They might have had banknotes, and some forms of coins, but it wasn't money wasn't quite the system like we think of it now. It was more bartering and such. Great questions. All right, if there are no more pressing questions, were there any mining areas nearby? Yes, in the north, Old Shasta was known as the Queen City of the Northern Mines. So a lot of miners lived up in that area and would go out mining from there. Okay, well, I want to thank you all so much for being here today. You've asked wonderful questions, and I hope you had as much fun as I did traveling back in time with Flat Stanley. If you're ever up here in the north traveling along I-5, I think you should stop in and say hi to us. We'd love to give you a tour of the homestead. And I hope you also learned how important it is to help a lending hand around your own homesteads. All right. I just want to thank you again, and farewell, pioneers.